My name is Kendra Hale, and I am 35 years old. 3 weeks ago, I sat in a quiet law office and learned my parents had spent my entire life teaching me one lesson: that I was easy to discard. The room smelled like polished wood and expensive cologne, the kind of place where people speak softly because money lives there. I remember the exact sound of the lawyer's papers sliding across the table, like the final page turning on my life. I had come expecting grief to be the hardest part. I was wrong. The lawyer cleared his throat and read out my father's last wishes, calmly, professionally, like he was reading a menu. My mother sat beside my sister with her hands folded neatly, eyes dry, posture perfect. My sister, Sloane, wore black that looked like it came with a private stylist and a backup plan. She didn't look at me once. I did not think about money. I did not think about fairness. I thought about the hospital room, the way my father's skin felt cool under my palm, the way he stared past me like he was looking for someone else. I thought about how I stayed up for days, answering nurse questions and signing forms, while my mother kept saying she needed quiet, and Sloane kept saying she couldn't get away. I thought I had earned something. Not a fortune, just acknowledgement, just the smallest proof that I existed in the same family. Then the lawyer said my name. He paused. The way people pause when they know what they're about to say will change a room. And then he announced that my inheritance was $1. Not 1,000, not 1%, not even a token object. $1. I felt my face go numb before my heart caught up. It wasn't shock first. It was humiliation. Because the silence around me wasn't soft. It was interested. It was hungry. It was the kind of silence people make when they're watching someone become a story they'll tell later. My sister's portion was read immediately after. It was the house, the accounts, the investments, the assets, the family history converted into numbers, and handed to her like it had always belonged in her lap. Nobody asked if I was okay. Nobody even pretended to be confused. I watched my mother's mouth pinch into something almost satisfied, like a long plan had finally gone exactly right. In that moment, grief didn't feel like sadness. It felt like clarity. A clean, sharp understanding of the hierarchy I had lived inside since I was little. I had always been the extra chair they didn't want to pull out. The daughter who was practical. The one who was fine. The one who didn't need as much. The one they could expect to adjust. I stood up before anyone could offer me pity. I left the room without giving them the gift of my tears. The elevator ride down felt like falling without motion. I remember staring at my own reflection in the metal doors, seeing a woman who had spent 35 years trying to earn warmth from people who rationed it like medicine. Outside, the sun was bright. People walked their dogs. Cars passed like the world hadn't just cracked open. And I told myself something I had never told myself before. I said, very quietly, as if my own life might overhear and laugh at me, "This is the end." But it wasn't. Because 3 days later, I went back to the house. Not to confront anyone. Not to beg. Not to fight. I told myself I was going to collect a few personal items from my childhood before Sloane turned the place into a museum of herself. I told myself I wanted closure. The truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about one thing from the hospital. The night my father died, he had looked at me with an expression I had never seen in him before. Not affection, not pride, something heavier, something frantic. His lips moved and he forced out a few words, the last thing he ever gave me. Study. Desk. Don't. He didn't finish. At the time I thought it was delirium, a dying brain grabbing at random objects. But after the will reading, those words started to sound less like nonsense and more like a warning. When I arrived at the house, my mother answered the door like I was an inconvenience she had already processed. Her voice was controlled, gentle in the way people are when they're trying to appear reasonable. She asked what I wanted. I said I was grabbing old things. She nodded like she approved of my obedience. The house felt exactly the same, and that made it worse. The same perfect furniture. The same framed photos. The same hallway where I learned to walk quietly so I wouldn't start something. And everywhere I looked, The same evidence, family pictures where Sloane was centered and glowing, and I was either cropped at the edge or missing entirely. I moved through the rooms like a stranger. My mother stayed in the kitchen, letting the silence do what it always did in our family, pressure me to leave without asking questions. I should have listened. Instead, I walked down the hallway to my father's study. The door was closed. It always was. In my childhood, that room was holy ground. My father's sanctuary. The place where decisions were made that shaped everyone else's lives. Sloane had walked in and out of it like she belonged there. I had been allowed in only when I was needed to fetch something, carry something, disappear again. My hand hesitated on the knob, and then I opened it. The smell hit me first. Old leather, dust, the faint sting of cigars that had soaked into the wood over decades. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, my heart beating hard enough to make my ribs ache. His desk was exactly where it had always been. Massive, polished, intimidating. A piece of furniture that looked like it had authority. I sat in his chair. That alone felt like rebellion. I started with the obvious drawers. Papers, notes, financial statements, photos of Sloan graduations, awards, trips. I found 3 framed pictures of her in a single drawer, like he kept them close the way someone keeps a promise. I did not find a single one of me. The absence was so deliberate it felt like it had weight. Then I noticed something I had never noticed before. The bottom right drawer slid out too easily, too shallow, and when I ran my fingers along the inside edges, I felt a seam that didn't belong there. My pulse spiked. My father's unfinished words echoed in my head. Studi. Desk. I pressed down on a corner panel. A soft click answered me. A hidden compartment opened like a mouth. Inside was a bundle wrapped in brown paper, a worn leather journal, and a thick envelope sealed with old wax. My hands were shaking as I lifted them out. It didn't feel like finding documents. It felt like trespassing into a version of my family that had been kept alive by secrecy. I stared at the wax seal. It was stamped with an imprint I recognized our family. Initial. The one my father used on formal letters. The one he treated like a brand. My throat tightened. Because this wasn't random. This wasn't forgotten paperwork. This was hidden on purpose. I carried everything out of the study with my heart hammering, moving like a thief in my own childhood home. I didn't go back through the front door. I left through the side, the way you leave when you don't want to be seen. I drove home gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers hurt, telling myself not to open anything until I was safe, telling myself to breathe, telling myself I wasn't dramatic, that I wasn't imagining things. The moment I got inside my apartment, I locked the door, set the bundle on my kitchen table, and just stared. I thought about all the times I had been told I was too sensitive, too suspicious, too much. I thought about the will reading, the $1, my mother's calm face, Sloane's silence. And then I broke the wax seal. The envelope opened with a sound that reminded me of bone cracking. Inside was paper older than me, older than my whole life. And the first line I read made my stomach drop so violently I had to sit down. Because it wasn't a letter. It wasn't an apology. It was proof. Proof that someone had been lying for decades. And as I read the header, an official document with a name I recognized, a date that didn't match anything my parents ever told me, I realized the $1 inheritance wasn't just cruelty, it was strategy. It was a cover. And if what I was holding was real, then my parents hadn't just disinherited me. They had stolen something that was never theirs to give. And in that moment, I understood why my father looked afraid before he died. Because he didn't just leave me out. He buried the truth where he thought I'd never find it. But I did. And the next 72 hours were going to decide whether I stayed the invisible daughter forever, or whether I became the problem they could never erase again. I stared at the document's signature, then I saw a second signature underneath it, and it was the name of someone my parents swore had been dead for 20 years. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after opening that envelope, staring at the document like it might disappear if I blinked too hard. My apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, but my head was loud. Every memory I had ever stored away as coincidence, misunderstanding, or bad luck started lining up in a way that made my chest feel tight. This wasn't just a paper. It was a crack in the version of my family I had been fed my entire life. The document was dated 14 years earlier, long before my father got sick, long before the polished image of unity my parents loved to perform. It carried legal formatting, official seals, and language so precise it felt cold. But beneath that precision was something unmistakable: intent. This was not a mistake. This was not forgotten. This was hidden. I read it slowly, forcing myself not to skim, because every sentence felt dangerous. It outlined ownership, rights, transfers, contingencies. Things my parents had always told me were too complicated for me to understand. Things they insisted only my sister had the mind for. And there it was, unmistakably clear. Before my parents rewrote everything, before the final will that left me $1, there had been another plan. One that did not center my sister. One that did not erase me. One that made my name appear exactly where it had never been allowed to appear before. I wasn't the spare. I was part of the foundation. My hands started to shake, not with excitement, but with a deep, nauseating realization. This meant that the version of my childhood I accepted as truth had been curated, carefully, strategically. Every dismissal, every exclusion, every time I was told to be grateful for less suddenly felt deliberate. The memories came fast after that. I remembered being told college funds were limited and that Sloane's education made more sense. I remembered being encouraged to choose something practical, something smaller, something that wouldn't require investment. I remembered the way my parents framed every unequal decision as logic, never favoritism. But the document didn't lie. It told a different story. One where my parents didn't just choose my sister over me emotionally. They chose her financially, legally, historically. They chose her early, and then spent years making sure I never questioned why. I picked up the leather journal next. It was my father's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. Heavy strokes, tight spacing, controlled. The kind of writing that looked like it didn't allow mistakes. The early pages were ordinary. Notes about meetings, reflections on work, lists of goals. But as I moved deeper, the tone shifted. The entries became less structured, more personal. And then I saw my name. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, and never kindly. I learned something painful in those pages. My father didn't see me as weak. He saw me as unpredictable. Someone who noticed patterns. Someone who asked questions. Someone who didn't accept the version of reality handed to her. He wrote about Sloane as stability, as image, as someone who fit seamlessly into the life he wanted to present to the world. He wrote about me as risk, and that explained everything. It explained why my emotions were treated like inconveniences, why my curiosity was reframed as disrespect, why my presence always felt conditional. I wasn't unwanted because I lacked value. I was unwanted because I threatened control. The final entries were written during his illness. The handwriting grew uneven. The sentences trailed off. But the message was clear enough to make my stomach drop. He knew what he had done. He knew the final will was wrong. And he knew the truth was still somewhere I could reach it. That was the moment I stopped crying. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because something colder replaced the pain. Something steadier. Something that didn't ask for permission. I wasn't dealing with grief anymore. I was dealing with a system. A system that had been designed to leave me powerless and quiet while my sister inherited not just money, but legitimacy. The $1 inheritance suddenly made sense. It wasn't meant to punish me. It was meant to protect them. If I was officially acknowledged as intentionally excluded, I would be less likely to look deeper, less likely to suspect theft instead of favoritism, less likely to challenge the story. They thought humiliation would keep me small. What they underestimated was what humiliation does when it finally runs out of room to sit. I didn't call my mother. I didn't confront Sloane. I didn't even tell anyone what I had found. I spent that night reading every page again, highlighting names, dates, connections. I laid everything out on the table like evidence, because that's what it was. and one name kept appearing. A name my parents had always spoken about in the past tense. A person they said had nothing to do with us anymore. A person whose absence was never explained, only enforced. According to the document, that person wasn't just alive at the time it was written. They were involved. Directly. I opened my laptop and started searching public records, something I had never been encouraged to do before. I followed paper trails my parents assumed I wouldn't understand. And with every click, the story they built cracked further. By dawn, my eyes burned and my coffee was cold. But I had confirmation. The signature at the bottom of that hidden document wasn't symbolic. It was binding. And if I was right, then the inheritance wasn't just unfair. It was illegal. My parents hadn't just rewritten their will. They had rewritten history. And suddenly, the question wasn't whether I deserved more than $1. The question was how long they thought they could keep me from discovering what was already mine. As the sun rose, my phone buzzed with a notification from a background check website, and the name that appeared on my screen confirmed my worst fear. The person my parents said was gone had been quietly watching everything from the beginning. When I saw that name on my screen, my first instinct was denial. Not disbelief, but refusal. The kind where your body understands the truth before your mind allows it in. I stared at the confirmation page until the letters blurred, then refreshed it, as if the internet might apologize and admit it made a mistake. It didn't. The person my parents had erased from our family history was alive. Not just alive, but traceable. Address listed, records updated. A quiet life continuing while my parents spoke of them like a closed chapter that didn't deserve footnotes. I sat back in my chair and felt something heavy settle in my chest. Not anger yet, something closer to dread. Because this meant my parents didn't just lie once. They maintained a lie. They curated it, protected it, repeated it for years, knowing I would grow up inside it. I went back to the journal, flipping pages with new eyes. Certain entries suddenly made sense. Mentions of loose ends, of necessary distance, of keeping the structure intact. Words I had once skimmed past now felt loaded, deliberate. This person wasn't an accident in my parents' story. They were a liability. And I was connected to them in a way my parents never wanted acknowledged. The more I searched, the clearer it became. The timeline aligned too perfectly to ignore. The document, the journal, the hidden compartment, my father's unfinished warning. None of it was random. I wasn't just excluded from the inheritance. I was excluded from the truth of who I was in the family system. That realization hurt more than the dollar ever could. I had spent my life believing I was the problem, that I was difficult, emotional, inconvenient, that I asked for too much because I didn't know my place. But the truth was far worse and far simpler. My place had been deliberately removed. I thought back to childhood moments that never quite made sense. The way my parents avoided certain topics. The way my questions were redirected or shut down. The way my sister was always framed as the right fit for the future, while I was encouraged toward independence as early as possible. They weren't preparing me for adulthood. They were distancing me from leverage. By late afternoon, I had the address. I stared at it for a long time before copying it down. My hands were steady now. That surprised me. I thought I'd be shaking, panicking, spiraling. Instead, I felt focused. If this person was alive, and if they were connected to the hidden document, then they were the missing piece my parents never accounted for. I drove without music, without distraction. The city blurred past me as I replayed conversations from my past, hearing them differently now. Every reassurance, every dismissal, every time my parents insisted something didn't matter. This mattered. I parked across the street and sat in my car longer than I meant to. The house was ordinary, quiet, the kind of place you'd never look at twice. No gates, no luxury, no signs of the power my parents liked to surround themselves with. I wondered how long this person had known about me, whether they had been waiting, whether they had been silenced. I rang the doorbell before I could lose my nerve. When the door opened, the face I saw wasn't what I expected. Older than the photo I'd found, but unmistakable. The same eyes I saw in my own reflection when I wasn't trying to look composed. The same tension around the mouth, like someone who learned early to hold things in. They looked at me, confused at first. Then something changed. Recognition, not familiarity. Awareness. They knew exactly who I was. That was when it hit me hardest. This person hadn't just been erased from my parents' story. They had been erased from mine. And yet, somehow, they knew me well enough to recognize me instantly. The silence between us stretched, heavy and emotional in a way words would have ruined. I could feel years pressing in on that moment. Years of absence. Years of choices made without me. Inside, the house was modest. Clean, lived in. No family portraits on the walls. No shrine to legacy. Just quiet evidence of survival. I sat down and waited, letting them speak first. I needed to hear it in their words, not mine. What I learned in the next hour reframed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, fear, and control. This wasn't a story about a family falling apart. It was about one being engineered. They told me how they were pushed out slowly, how access was reduced, how communication was framed as conflict, how my parents rewrote narratives to justify cutting ties. Not because this person was dangerous, but because they wouldn't cooperate. They wouldn't agree to terms that excluded me. That was the part that made my throat tighten. I wasn't collateral damage. I was the reason. This person had insisted I be acknowledged, included, protected, and for that, they were removed. Quietly, efficiently, with the same calm logic my parents used on me my whole life. The hidden document wasn't just about assets, it was about intent. And it had been buried because if I ever found it, I wouldn't just question the inheritance. I would question the entire moral authority of the people who raised me. When I left the house, the sky had darkened. I sat in my car again, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the weight of what I now knew settle into my bones. My parents didn't underestimate me. They feared me. They feared what would happen if I ever saw the full picture. And now I had a choice. I could confront them emotionally and watch them deny everything, or I could do what they never expected me to do. I could act quietly, strategically, with proof, because the next step wasn't about revenge, it was about exposure. As I turned the key in the ignition, my phone lit up with a message from an unknown number, and the first line told me my parents had already realized something was wrong. The message stayed on my screen longer than it should have. I didn't open it right away. I already knew, instinctively, that whatever was written there meant one thing: the balance had shifted. For the first time in my life, my parents were reacting to me instead of directing me. That alone told me how dangerous the truth was. When I finally read it, the tone was casual on the surface. Concerned. Almost kind. The kind of message that pretends nothing is wrong while quietly asking how much you know. My mother wanted to meet. Not to talk about grief. Not to check on me. She wanted to clear the air about the will. She said there had been misunderstandings. That emotions were high. That family matters shouldn't be handled through outsiders. Outsiders. That word stuck with me. Because suddenly I wasn't the outsider anymore. They were. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I sat with the realization that my parents were doing something they had never done before. Backpedaling. The $1 inheritance was supposed to end the conversation. It was supposed to shame me into silence. Instead, it triggered something they couldn't control. They didn't know what I had found. But they knew I had found something. I went back through everything one more time. The hidden document. The journal. The public records. The confirmation from the person they erased. I treated it like a case file, not a memory. Because emotions blur things. Evidence doesn't. What stood out most was consistency. Dates aligned. Language repeated. Decisions echoed each other. My parents hadn't acted impulsively. They had followed a plan, adjusting it as needed to keep one outcome intact. My exclusion. I realized then that confronting them directly would only give them what they wanted. Chaos they could later label as proof that I was unstable. Emotional. Dramatic. Unreliable. I wasn't going to give them that. Instead, I made an appointment. Not with the family lawyer who read the will. Someone else. Someone who didn't know my parents. Someone who didn't owe them loyalty. I walked into that office carrying a folder thick enough to change how people sat in their chairs. The attorney didn't interrupt as I explained. They didn't rush me. They asked questions that cut through emotion and landed directly on responsibility. And when I finished, they leaned back and said something I'll never forget. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a concealment issue. The words landed with a weight that made my hands tremble, not from fear, but from validation. For decades, I had been told I was exaggerating patterns that were never accidental. Now, a professional was confirming what my instincts had known all along. What my parents did wasn't just unfair. It was deliberate misrepresentation. That changed everything. When I left the office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, like someone who had finally stepped out of fog and into daylight. The fear I had carried for years, the fear of being wrong, of being dramatic, loosened its grip, because now, the truth didn't depend on my parents' approval. It existed on paper. That night, my sister called for the first time since the will reading. Her voice was controlled, measured, familiar in the way someone speaks when they're trying to reclaim authority. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't mention grief. She asked what I was doing. That question told me everything. They were coordinating. They had noticed the shift. I kept my responses neutral, short, non-committal. I didn't deny anything. I didn't confirm anything. I let uncertainty do what emotion never could. Silence unnerves people who rely on narrative control. The next morning, my mother showed up at my apartment unannounced. That was new. She stood there with that same composed expression, but her eyes scanned the space behind me, like she was searching for something she couldn't see. Evidence. Proof. Confirmation that I knew more than I was supposed to. She talked about family unity, about mistakes, about how hard things had been. She said my father had made decisions under pressure, that nothing was meant to hurt me, but she never denied what mattered. She never said the document wasn't real. She never said the person they erased was lying. That silence was louder than any confession. I realized then that my parents weren't sorry for what they did. They were afraid of what I might do next. And that fear gave me clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I simply told her I was taking time to understand things fully before making any decisions. Her expression tightened just slightly. She left soon after, reminding me that family matters should stay private. That was the moment I knew. They weren't worried about reconciliation. They were worried about exposure. Because if the truth came out, it wouldn't just change who got the money. It would change how people saw them. And that mattered more to them than any relationship ever had. That night, I organized everything into a single file. Chronological. Clean. Unemotional. I labeled it clearly and saved backups in places I didn't usually think to look. I wasn't planning revenge. I was preparing for inevitability, because when people build their power on silence, the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to stay quiet. And the final step wasn't confronting my parents. It was deciding how much of the truth the world was about to see. Just before I shut my laptop, an email notification appeared, and the sender was the same law firm that had handed my sister millions while leaving me $1. I didn't open the email right away. I let it sit there, unread, glowing on my screen like a warning light. That law firm had already played its role in humiliating me once. They had sat across from me, neutral and detached, while my sister's future was announced, and my existence was reduced to a symbolic dollar. Seeing their name again felt like being summoned back into a room where the rules were never written for me. When I finally opened it, the language was careful, polite, procedural. They were requesting a meeting to clarify recent developments related to my parents' estate. No apology. No acknowledgement of how final they had made everything feel just weeks earlier. Just a quiet shift in tone that told me something had changed behind closed doors. I read the email twice, then a third time. And that was when it hit me. They weren't inviting me out of courtesy. They were inviting me because they had to. The realization sent a cold wave through me. Institutions don't change direction unless forced. Law firms don't reopen files because of fairness. They do it because someone with leverage has asked questions they can't ignore. And suddenly, all the pieces lock together. The hidden document, the erased person, the journal entries, the timing of my mother's visit, my sister's call. None of it was coincidence. The will I had been shown wasn't the full story. It was the version my parents believed would hold. I went back to the document I found in the desk and read it again, slower this time, paying attention not just to what it said, but to what it implied. It referenced amendments, conditions, contingencies that were never mentioned during the official reading. It wasn't a replacement for the final will. It was a safeguard, something designed to activate only if the truth surfaced. My parents hadn't just buried it. They had assumed I'd never be in a position to uncover it, understand it, or act on it. They had counted on my silence the same way they always had. What they didn't account for was how much clarity comes when you have nothing left to lose. I went to the meeting prepared in a way I had never been prepared for anything in my life. I brought copies, timelines, notes. I didn't bring emotion. I didn't bring accusations. I brought facts and let them do the talking. The atmosphere in that conference room was nothing like the first time. There was no casual authority, no air of finality. People leaned forward. Pens moved quickly. Questions were asked carefully, the way professionals ask questions when they already know the answers but need them confirmed. And that's when I learned the most shocking truth of all. The will that gave my sister millions and left me $1 had been contested once before. Not by me. By the very person my parents erased. Years ago. Quietly. Sealed. Withdrawn under pressure. The room seemed to tilt when I understood what that meant. My parents had been living with this risk for years. They had known their version of the story was fragile. They had known one wrong move could bring everything into question. So they did what they always did. They controlled the narrative. They framed me as emotional so I wouldn't be believed. They made my sister the center so no one would ask why. They turned silence into tradition and obedience into virtue. And the $1 inheritance wasn't an afterthought. It was the final lock on a door they thought I'd never try to open. The law firm didn't say my parents were wrong. They didn't have to. Their questions did that for them. By the end of the meeting, I wasn't seen as the overlooked daughter anymore. I was seen as a variable. A risk. Someone who could change outcomes simply by refusing to disappear. That realization followed me all the way home. I thought about my childhood again, but this time without the old self-blame. I saw the pattern clearly now. Every time I had been pushed aside, it wasn't because I lacked value. It was because I had too much of it in the wrong places. I noticed things. I remembered things. I asked questions. Those qualities weren't flaws. They were threats. That night I received another message from my sister. Short. Controlled. Asking if we could talk like adults. I didn't respond. For the first time, I understood that her confidence had always been borrowed, propped up by a system designed to favor her. Without that system, she was just as uncertain as everyone else. I slept better that night than I had since the funeral. Not because things were resolved, but because they were finally honest. The illusion was gone. The truth was no longer something I carried alone. And the most shocking part wasn't that my parents had done all this. It was that they had built their entire future on the assumption that I would never push back. They were wrong, because the final step wasn't theirs to control anymore. The truth had momentum now, and the next move would decide whether the $1 lie collapsed quietly, or whether it exploded into something no one could contain. The following morning, I received a certified letter marked urgent, and the first line confirmed that the estate was being reopened with consequences no one in my family had prepared for. The certified letter felt heavier than paper should. I stood in my kitchen holding it, aware that whatever was inside would permanently divide my life into before and after. There are moments when you know you can't go back to being who you were, even if you wanted to. This was one of them. The estate was officially reopened. Not under emotional grounds. Not because of family tension, but because of material non-disclosure. That phrase changed everything. It meant the $1 inheritance was no longer a humiliation story. It was evidence. Evidence that something substantial had been concealed, something that altered the intent of the estate in a way the law could not ignore. Within days, everything moved faster than I expected. Meetings were scheduled, documents were requested, timelines were reconstructed. My parents were no longer the calm, composed figures who controlled every room they entered. They were defensive, careful, quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. My mother stopped calling altogether. My sister sent one last message, longer than the others, explaining how hurt she was that I was doing this to the family. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was cruel, but because it was revealing. Even now, even with proof unfolding around us, she saw herself as the victim of my refusal to stay small. I didn't respond. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was focused on being accurate. The review uncovered things that couldn't be explained away, amendments that were referenced but never disclosed, assets that were shifted quietly before the final will was executed, a pattern of decisions that benefited one heir while neutralizing the other. And then came the part that broke me in a way I didn't expect. A statement written by my father, dated months before his illness worsened, was entered into the review. Not a formal confession, not an apology, just a clarification of intent that had never been shared. In it, he acknowledged that excluding me entirely would raise questions, that I was more perceptive than people assume, that keeping me uninformed was necessary to preserve order. Reading those words hurt more than the dollar ever did, because it confirmed what I had always felt but was told was wrong. They didn't underestimate me. They feared me. The final determination didn't come with fireworks. No dramatic announcement, no courtroom scene, just a quiet recalculation of truth. The concealed document was validated. The erased involvement was acknowledged. The estate was restructured to reflect what had been intentionally hidden. The outcome wasn't revenge. It was correction. And when it was over, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because I had gained anything tangible, but because I had lost something. I carried my entire life the belief that I was disposable. I saw my parents once more after that. Briefly. Formally. There were no raised voices. No confrontation. Just distance. The kind that comes when denial no longer works and silence no longer protects. My sister didn't look at me. I didn't need her to. Because the truth had done something no argument ever could. It had shifted the story permanently. Not just legally, but internally. I wasn't the difficult one. I wasn't the dramatic one. I wasn't the daughter who deserved less. I was the one they couldn't control. And that's why they tried to erase me. Today, when I think back to that law office and the dollar placed in my inheritance, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity. That dollar wasn't meant to measure my worth. It was meant to end the conversation. They never imagined I'd keep asking questions. They never imagined I'd open the desk. They never imagined I'd find the truth they buried. But I did. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's this. When people give you almost nothing, sometimes it's because they're afraid of how much you actually deserve. The most shocking part of this story isn't that my parents left me $1. It's that they built their entire future on the hope that I'd never realize why. And sometimes I wonder if I hadn't opened that desk drawer that day, how many other families are still living inside lies they were never meant to question.